episode 167 of Silver Lining for Learning. I'm Chris Deedy with Harvard University. My co-host with me is Punya Mishra from Arizona State University. Our other two co-hosts are abroad this Saturday, so unable to participate, but we're very excited about this topic of experiential learning and its potential impact on post-secondary education. I am not a depth expert on experiential learning. I do like watching Rick Steves' travel episodes, which are kind of an indirect form of experiential learning. I have funded 2 of my kids to be part of Travel for Teens, which has been great for them and kind of vicarious for me. But of course, true experiential learning can be very deep and very powerful. And so I'm really happy that Howard and Anastasia are here to help us learn more about it. So I'm going to ask you, Howard, first, and then Anastasia to talk a little about yourself and about your involvement with this topic.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Punya, Anastasia, it's nice to be here. My name is Howard Lurie. I'm the Senior Vice President for Research and Evaluation at an organization called Academic Programs International. We are a provider and platform of services for students who want to, for lack of a better word, learn something outside the 4 walls or 4 screens of their post-secondary institution, also with high school students as well. So under that rubric is the typical education abroad or education away, sometimes known as study abroad over the years, internships, applied learning, practicums, a whole cauldron of various activities that we provide for students and work with universities and enable students to go right now about 25 different countries, as well as programs within the United States. My specific area of focus is I head up all of our research that we do through API and also an affiliated API foundation. And we're particularly interested in 2 big questions. One is, what is the demand for experiential learning across many different segments and sectors? And secondly, what is the impact? And we've committed a major research agenda to solve that question. And we're looking forward to telling you more about what we're up to and also getting your questions, Punya and Chris. Thanks.
Ariana?
Hi, my name is Anastasia Vrachnos.
Anastasia, sorry.
That's okay, Christian. Kidding.
Yeah, fair enough. I've been called worse, believe me.
I'm serving as the Vice Provost of Global Education and Strategic Initiatives at the University of San Francisco. Chris was kind enough in the warm-up to solicit a couple of details about ourselves and ask us to talk about why we're in this field in the first place. And I want to say it was transformative for me as I was graduating from college and realizing that I had a college education with big deficits about huge parts of the world. And in my case, realizing that I didn't know anything about Asia, which was billions of people, and going out there and having a service fellowship that was transformative in my career. I ended up spending over a decade working in Asia and living in different parts of Southeast Asia. And I consider that the best qualities of myself, and they don't come out every day, but the best ones that have to do with, being part of something bigger than myself and collectivity, and being able to navigate difference and celebrate it, that those came from that experience of living in another culture and learning from another culture. And that's what's kept me in this field. I've been in this field 25 years. I've run a not-for-profit nonprofit that's been around for 125 years, sending young people to, I used to say to screw them up in the same wonderful way that I got screwed up. I don't think it's appropriate to say that anymore, given all the challenges our young people are facing. But certainly the experiences and outcomes that we can equip them with these kind of experiences, I think prepare them to face those challenges with a little bit more readiness. I've served as the senior international officer at 3 higher ed institutions, currently, as I mentioned, at University of San Francisco. Part of what drew me there was the commitment to the whole person. They call it in Jesuit pedagogy, cura personalis, educating the whole person. And that includes an implicit acknowledgement of how important all of these outside of the classroom experiences are to your education. And I'm committed to that idea of knocking down the walls of the classroom and integrating experiences with what's happening in the classroom. I also really appreciate the profound commitment that the institution has to global experience and to integrating and celebrating differences. I'm not the hugest fan of rankings at all, but I do want to say, since they just came out and it's timely, the thing I'm most proud of is University of San Francisco's #1 in the nation ranking as a campus for ethnic diversity. Because I think one of the things, as we think about the future and climate change and accessibility of global education, we also have to change our definitions of what it means. So it's not just about exporting, forgive the term, but sending our students and scholars out. It's also about who comes to our threshold, the experiences and perspectives and cultural backgrounds they share and enrich our learning context with. And I think that's just as important as anything we're doing when we send folks out. I just want to say that I'm grateful to Howard for bringing me in. And I think that the research that API is doing is so important, both around demand, but also around impact. We don't have great measures for capturing the impact of these experiences and how it's very hard to capture how you transform someone's perspective. And I think it needs to be done longitudinally, because these experiences are like time release capsules. They leave you they leave you insights over time that unfold over time. So having an organization that's committed the resources as the foundation at API has to help us measure that over time and over different demographic groups, I think is critical. And it's something that's missing in the industry right now. So thanks for having me.
Punya.
Yeah, I just had a quick question of clarification, because when we talk about experiential learning, it can be along many dimensions. So you could have, you're taking a class at the university and you're going and working, you're doing a real project with some industry affiliate or something that way. I mean, so that one could regard as experiential learning. What I'm hearing from the two of you is experiential learning in this sort of sense of going to another country. So there's an international component to that. Am I correct in that assumption? And so how, so I think the broader question would be like, how in this particular context are you defining experiential learning? I mean, like it's John Dewey said, that we all learn from experience, but not all experiences are equally educative.
Right.
So one can have a very powerful learning experience in a classroom, that happens too, right? And so I just want to get a better sense, at least for our viewers and for me personally, when you say experiential learning, what exactly do you mean by that? Because I was a little confused. I had a different idea in my head.
That's a great question. Let me take a swing at that. And I know Anastasia has some really interesting examples of the work she's doing right now at University of San Francisco. So we think of it as actually putting you not necessarily bound by international borders. I mean, I think of it as the extension of for lack of better words, sort of content and skills delivery that happens within an academic setting. And maybe the broadest way to think of this is the applied part of that. So I would think certainly the programs we work on and what we try and study and research does include workplace internships. That could be a short form. It could be another part of the same country in which that student is matriculated in an institution. I know that there are branches of quote unquote experiential learning that deal with outdoor education, with physical journeys, the work that Chris mentioned with his kids, which is great. So we think of it as the rubric under which classic study abroad or education abroad programs happen. But I also think of education away. We see a lot of interest, and one of the reasons why we're doing this work is issues of access and equity, where students want to have some experience outside their academic setting, but don't necessarily know how to do that. And institutions sometimes not necessarily knowing how to do that either, or support that. But that's how we think of it. But I think it's a big tent. I want to kick it back over to Anastasia. I just have to say, I love listening to what you say, and I love the time capsule concept. And I think that might be a whole new a metaphor we use. But I know you're doing some really cool stuff. And what do you think of that question?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And along the lines of what you said, really, I think the notion of global education is passé. I mean, don't tell my bosses that, because that's what they think I'm doing. But I think what we're talking about is a spectrum of different experiences that allow us to contextualize learning. And you use the word applied. I think that's one aspect of it. But I think of it as Velcro. They create Velcro for other classroom things and theoretical things and exercises to stick to. It's part of finding our passion in life. It's part of finding the things we think are most relevant to the problems we're going to be facing in the world. So I would define it as experiences that deliver a set of learning outcomes. Those learning outcomes might have to do with navigating ambiguity and difference. They might have to do with being able to work in multi-disciplinary teams or synthesizing across disciplines, being able to work in teams with other people. And they might include certain kinds of learning outcomes that are becoming endangered, if you will, in the academy. Again, forgive my, I'll probably be fired after this, but that's okay. In experiential learning, you have to go down, fighting for what you believe in. I think that learning, giving space for young people to take good risks, so good risk taking, is something that's increasingly difficult to find in college now, and for many good reasons. I mean, institutions are becoming more risk averse, and they have to be. And we could discuss that; would be a whole separate podcast. But I think the opportunity to go out, strike out on one's own with the right levels of support, also gives an independence and an empowerment over one's learning and an enablement to take some risks that ultimately are the key to the intellectual traditions, not only of liberal arts, but the mantle of Americans' entrepreneurialism, if you will. How do we continue to contribute to the world as a place that takes big risks to solve big problems? How are we teaching our youth to do that? I think we need to continue to create these spaces, and experiential learning is one of the places we can do that.
I want to follow up briefly with something to the follow-up. I mean, because going back to this time capsule concept, I mean, one of the things I think, one of the through lines we think of is in experiential learning is the challenge, but also the enormous opportunity for students to reflect on that experience. And sometimes reflection happens because of ambiguity or surprise or taking a skill set or taking a piece of content or knowledge they might have learned or mastered to some level of competency within a classroom, and then being in a setting where things happen and things go sideways, and then having to respond to that ambiguity or that surprise, and then later on thinking how they unpack that and how they reflect upon that experience. And I think that's the time capsule notion we've seen and what we want schools and students and also the larger context of the world to understand the value of that it is almost like a experience release dosage, that something happens, you reflect on it, you think about it, oh, I remember when I had to deal with, maybe it's a language translation, or maybe it's a culture question, or maybe it's simply the applied a clarification of a concept within a setting that is real world, is real life. And I would agree with Anastasia. We think this is not to the necessarily the detriment of post-secondary institutions or secondary institutions, but almost amplifying their impact. And that's why I'm in this field, and why I'm interested in seeing what we can do to improve it.
So thank you for that. And I have lots of things to follow up on, but
Sure.
Anastasia, I'll just say this. I was on a podcast once where I talked about how much I enjoy what I do as a part of my job. And I said that, I can't believe that I get paid to do this. And like an idiot, when the podcast came out, I sent it to my dean. And she was flying and she was listening on the plane. The moment the plane lands, she sends me a text saying, "Okay, we need to renegotiate your salary." So there are risks involved. And I was like, okay, I should never share anything with you. So I hear you.
Right,
But
sure.
thank you for that. Chris, you can follow up. I have some more questions, but we can always
Sure.
Yeah,
meet back.
let me follow up and then toss it back to you for more questions.
One thing, Chris, and everybody, my dog is pawing at the door. So if I switch off my video, it's because I'm listening. I need to go take care of that for a second.
Sure. No problem.
Okay. So let me unpack what I'm hearing and get your feedback on whether I'm accurate or not. Some of what I'm hearing is that this is an opportunity to get a shift in perspective. Alan Kay is credited with saying that a shift in perspective is worth 80 IQ points. And being somewhere quite different than what you're used to does bring culture, context, language, potentially, into shifting your perspective. But I'm also hearing that there's another dimension here, which is sort of adventure and exploration. And, in the world, the opportunities for really seeking out wild adventure have disappeared in many ways as frontiers have disappeared and the world has become globalized. And and yet that adventure is important for young people. And Howard, I think you said agency, or Anastasia, it might have been you, but saying to somebody, it's kind of a rite of passage, saying to somebody, you're ready to go to somewhere really different where things can go wrong and probably will, and you can handle this and therefore feel empowered to go and do it again. So at least those three dimensions, which I think have cognitive, affective, and social components, seem to me to be part of what you're saying.
Chris, I'd love to respond to that, and thanks. It's so useful to hear your unpacking of what we say. I think that's exactly right. Though I might label it and nuance it a different way, primarily because I think folks in our industry are sensitive about not doing tourism, not doing travel, doing something that is substantive and educational and responsible and ethical. And so sometimes adventure can connote a lot of different things, particularly in a country where we have a history of colonialism and adventure. That's in many ways the antithesis of some of the goals that we've set out. But I do think that some of the values overlap, and particularly around how to engage with the unknown. How to engage when we don't have a roadmap for our success. For me, I think one of the greatest things that a young person can come out of an experience like this with, I mean, of course, there's foreign languages, there's changes in perspective, but you mentioned that notion of agency, the idea that you took a leap into the unknown and it was scary, and you came out the other side having figured it out and having gleaned important things. That's amazing. That can keep you from not staying in a dead-end job because you have to pay your mortgage, right? It has implications in life that are huge. And again, to go back to this longevity piece that Howard and I mentioned, that you may see in 1 year when you come back, but you will feel differently about in 5, 10, 15, and 20 years when you have had to make decisions in your life and take on the unknown. So I would frame it a little bit differently, but I agree that that is a big part of it. Howard, what do you think?
I've often wondered, is there something universally developmental about the urge at 18, 19, 20, 21? But I think it doesn't go away, to be someplace else and to, in some ways, maybe test your own assumptions as much as you might understand what those might be, and test your own knowledge base. Can I function? Can I apply the concept of, I've learned it in an accounting class or a marketing class or a civil engineering class, to a real world structure problem opportunity? And I think, I know, Chris, you've done a lot of work on lifelong learning. I think in some ways the challenge of our sector is to continue to inculcate that's a good urge to sort of test yourself in other settings. I agree with Anastasia. I think that, I don't know if I would say adventure as much as, because I think one of the things we're trying to get students to think about, and also the institutions that work with them to think about, are sort of the cultural assumptions people have about when they go someplace else, and then the relationship between just not having the value or benefit of the experience only on the learner itself, but on the place where they are learning. And so if you look at the history of quote unquote study abroad, I mean, the ancestors are the finishing tour of the wealthy and the Brahmin class, which I think after World War II, when the United States was looking outwards, was trying to the ambassadors of quote unquote democracy. I don't want to get all political, but that's where a lot of quote unquote study abroad major institutions and programs started. Enrollment in higher education was booming. And I think that became part of the early phases of this. I know people have written volumes on the history of study abroad, so I don't pretend to be an expert on that. But I think now we're evolving in a very different direction. And I think that's the exciting challenge that we're trying to work on.
And Punya, I'll toss it to you, but I just want to quickly say, I really appreciate the nuance and thank you for the reframing. We certainly know that when people from global North countries show up, particularly in global South countries, that there's a history behind it, and that we have to be careful to signal that we're moving beyond that history and trying to make, in a sense, a new beginning about what it means to have these kinds of cultural exchanges, and each side
Yes.
richly learning from the other. So I appreciate your saying that. I think that the self-directed part, as you do, is really important. Lifelong learning is going to be largely self-directed. It's not going to be continuously getting one degree after another. And sometimes my wonderful students at Harvard make me nervous because they seem to have an assumption that if you want to learn something new, you take another course or you enter another degree
Right.
program, which perhaps only the Brahmins can afford to do, but you don't need to do it. And in fact, as you know, there's lots of things that can't be taught in classrooms, even by the most talented teachers. So I appreciate the reframing, and I think that if we don't graduate people somehow who are self-directed, they're in trouble in life, no matter how well prepared they are in other ways. Punya.
Thanks, Chris. No, I really do just want to second what Chris said in terms of, I mean, I'm originally from India, right? So I completely understand, anytime I've done projects, international projects, usually in India, just because I'm from there, so I feel the sort of connection. One of the things that I try to really make clear to the team that is going from here is that I say that, we don't want to be seen as the World Bank, which is fly in with some solutions about a context that we don't understand, right? That this is truly a bi-directional learning process, which I think, so I do appreciate that nuance there. So I just had a quick comment and then a question. So the comment was that I have talked to so many people who have had their lives changed because they went on, a Peace Corps or something like that. One of my close friends, King Beach, went to Nepal, and his entire career changed after that. His life, I mean, his name is King. He got himself a Nepali name. When he's in Nepal, they call him Raja, which is the word for king in Nepali. He speaks Nepali now, and that's become the world that, that's international education has become his commitment. And it came from this one trip that he took when he was a young man. And there are many stories like that. And the other one, which I want to sort of talk about briefly, is I was at Michigan State before I came to ASU, and my previous dean there, Carol Ames, she very early on sort of recognized, I'm talking about early 2000s, that there were two things that teacher prep programs were, or our doctoral programs were not doing well. One was, which was sort of my bailiwick, which was, thinking about technology and learning. And the other one was that we were not giving our doctoral students global perspectives. So she made a commitment from the college that every doctoral student would have an international experience before they graduated, almost fully funded by the college. And you can imagine, that MSU is a big college of education. We would have, a lot of doctoral students. So that was a huge commitment on her part. But I think that was truly transformative for our doctoral students, because you sort of have this lens of this is how education is done. And going to India or Bangladesh or Mali or wherever you may go, gives you a very different perspective on what learning is, what teaching is, the sort of the socio-political, cultural dimensions of education, and how complicated that phenomena can be, and still be functioning in a very different kind of way. It just opens you up to rethink your research questions, rethink your career agenda, and so on. So that was sort of the comment that I wanted to make. The question I had, and I think, Howard, you're going to possibly like this question. As I'm hearing you guys talk, I'm hearing words like adventure, exploration, I'm hearing longevity, leap into the unknown, lifelong learning. Now, in terms of assessment and evaluation, when I teach a class on X, I sort of know what the textbook says the end results of that class need to be in terms of student learning and achievement. Here, when you're going in, you have no idea in what way this thing is going to impact the student. It might be that they see their curriculum or the program that they're doing in a new light, but it might be that it opens their eyes in ways that they might not even realize till 10 years later, like, oh my God, that was a transformative experience for me. The example I'll give is my daughter. When my daughter was a freshman here at ASU, I insisted that she do a study abroad. And she went to Italy. And I remember getting phone calls from her crying, like, I'm on the street, I've missed my bus, I don't know what to do. And I'm like, you got to figure it out, girl. There's nothing we can do from here. And as an 18-year-old, she did figure it out. And I can see those. Now, how do I measure something like that? How do I sort of do research on it to prove to Anastasia, your bosses, that there is, in the most blunt terms, ROI. But I'm not even saying that, it's going to lead to money, but that there is something that is gained here, which is above and beyond of whatever we could do in the classroom. We know it, but how do we show it, I think, is the question that I'm sort of leaning towards. So whoever wants to take it first.
Maybe I'll make a general comment, because I think Howard's the one that has really interesting things to say on how do we capture it and how do we tell that story. I'll just say that I think all of these things that we're talking about, they're about an architecture of the mind, forgive the phrase, but it's about ways of thinking and knowing that we all know have to change. I mean, higher ed has been doing things in certain ways that cultivate certain mindsets. And we are finding, I don't think this comes as a shock to anyone, that we are not innovating quickly enough for how fast the world is changing. And then you layer onto that things like pandemics, where in an instant, your base assumptions all change about what is education. And you find that the folks that I think have had that rug pulled out from under them in various ways, whether it's through experiential learning or other ways, are able to adjust more quickly. So I think part of what we're trying to do is change that architecture of the mind, even to suggest, as you were saying, Punya, that people rethinking the base assumptions of their research agendas, or just to suggest that the idea of linearity, right? I want to learn this. Okay, that's my point B. Let me work backwards. What are the 5 things I need to do to get to point B? Well, the idea of these kind of experiences is that as you step into your first couple of steps towards your point B might change. So how do we capture all of that, especially since it's longitudinal? I'm going to toss that really easy question over to Howard.
Um, so it's a great question, and I'm trying to think of an expedient way to react. But what we think about is, I mean, we argue, our approach is to say there's actually a skills architecture that we can actually map what happens when someone is in a new setting, learning something new, both with both the functional blocking and tackling of learning, and also the cultural and language experiences they're going to have to adapt to. We would argue that there is a way to measure that and to track that. And employers sometimes refer to these as, and I hate this term, I don't think they're soft at all. I don't think they're soft skills, but people tend to say, well, put all these things that are not learning are and call them soft skills. I think they're human skills. I think they're communication skills. And what we've built and what we work with our students and the institutions who work with our students is helping them literally map through reflection and through literally a post experience offboarding, I guess you could call it, to how to reflect and articulate that they have learned some skills that are going to be applicable to whatever they're going to do next, whether it's an academic career or it's a career pathway or whatever that might be. Because we think that's been one of the huge gaps in education abroad, is that students return. And the question that I think this sector has not asked is, was the transformational impact of a quote unquote study abroad program a function of the social capital a student had before they went? Or was it something that happened to them while they went? And we think that's a fair question. And because one of the underlying sort of themes of our work is when we've looked across high school students and college students, and we asked them, do you want an internship? Do you want a study abroad experience? The demand is between 50 and 75% of those high school and college students say, yes, I want an internship, I want a study abroad experience. The throughput is between 3 and 5%. So the demand is enormous, and the actual numbers of students who have these experiences is a fraction of that demand. Now, that's a whole nother silver lining learning question we could debate ad nauseum. So we're interested in saying that when you have these experiences, what happens to you can be mapped, can be articulated. And we think the challenge, as Anastasia is alluding to, is for institutions to acknowledge that these are not just some extracurricular, nice to have skills. These are essential human skills that I think are sort of at the heart and soul of how whatever industry or whatever profession or whatever career or whatever trade someone is going to have going forward. And it's often been, oh, you had a great experience, it's transformational, isn't that nice for you? And we're saying, well, let's unpack that. Let's make sure we know how to measure that, equip students with the ability to talk about that. I mean, we laugh sometimes because we hear what your daughter is saying, what your experience and Chris is saying. My own kids, soon Anastasia's kids, when they go, so I went on this experience, it changed my life. And we're asking the question, why? How did it change you? And how do you talk about the change? And what value does that change have when you make decisions going forward with whatever you're going to do? So that's a long-winded question, but we think it's possible to do, and we think that it's essential to do.
Go ahead, Anastasia.
Yeah, if there's time, I just wanted to add, I mean, I think there are some tools out there in the marketplace that attempt to do some pieces of this, particularly around capturing changes in empathy and intercultural skills. So one of them that we've used at USF is the Intercultural Development Inventory, known as the IDI. And it can capture changes based on an experience, but you have to have a control. You have to have done it before you go, and you have to do it after you go. And so there's some some ways in traditional assessment that are out there. What I also think about is not only the skills that one gets when one has these experiences, but the perspective you bring back to your own home country. So the gratitude, for example, that comes with coming back to the United States and recognizing certain things that we have, maybe not all, you want to change some, but in my own experience, I had the experience of living in a country where it wasn't democratic and where voting wasn't guaranteed. And it had a profound effect on me, knowing that I had the ability to cast a vote. And there, there are lots of reasons why casting a vote in the U.S. is also imperfect. But what I want to suggest is that there are also some measures, and one of them might be a measure of civic engagement, that it would be interesting to track over time and try to see if there's a correlation with that data. And civic engagement is just one example. And I haven't seen that done. And I think that the kind of research that Howard is doing opens up the door for us to have data sets that then we can track and maybe overlay with other data sets we have, to really start to capture over 20 years. What is there a difference? And, the other piece that's really hard about what you're asking, Punya, is that when we do anything longitudinal, of course, there's no way to show what's causal and what's correlative, right? So we'll have to deal with that as well. But just showing that there are increase in certain categories or areas of outcomes, I think is a good starting point.
And again, I just want to be clear, I wasn't making the case that we need to find sort of standardized test for these things. That's not the point I'm making, but that's part of the game that one has to play at some level. I mean, we are sort of preaching to the converted in the four of us, I think, right? I mean, so it's not that we are questioning that, but at some level, I can see funding agencies or universities asking, and not just saying that give us like raw numbers, but give us some evidence that this is, and sometimes it could be stories because of individuals, just like couple that we have already shared, like Anastasia, you have shared, and I shared of my daughter, and there could be many more, which also can be quote unquote evidence for why this is important. So anyway, Chris, I know you were waiting.
Well, I see the time going by, and I want to get to a couple things that often we do on this show, because beyond describing something, often people want to know how to do it. So I'm imagining that some of the people who view this or listen to this will be people who maybe like your dean at Michigan State, who will say, wow, I think I want to add this in to my academic program, or in some other way to give the people that I work with this kind of opportunity. What advice would you have for people who may not be doing much with study abroad now academically, but who are excited by this and would like to do more?
I know Anastasia has great ideas in this. Let me quickly frame it and then kick it over to her. I mean, we actually see, and your example about your MSU PhD students is great, but I think it's an outlier. I mean, we see a lot of institutions at the undergraduate level, I would say, predominantly, and particularly in engineering and in STEM, who, I don't know what the logic model is, but there is greater and higher walls for STEM students to have these experiences, because I think they're considered to be supplemental. They're considered to be not the skills, quote unquote hard skills that an institution wants its students to graduate. I can think of a couple of institutions in Texas, for example, that in prior years had endowment funding for every engineering student to have a global experience, and those are being discontinued. I think the way around that, the way to react to that, is to listen to faculty, because I think faculty have a clear sense, in whatever field they're imparting skills and knowledge and content knowledge to, of the value of this. And oftentimes what we see happen is faculty might say, I would like my students to explore 3 wind technologies, just as pick an example, in 3 different locations, because it will give you comparative analyses of how engineers in that field are solving a particular problem. And it's a great idea, but the structures of institutions often say, well, that doesn't work in scheduling. I'm not sure we can have credit transfer. We don't want students to delay to graduation. We don't want to incur more debt. There's costs to these programs. But I think listening to faculty who often say the value of the outcomes outweigh the challenges and the obstacles, and we'll figure out a way to do it, would be my first level of advice. Because I think they're the subject matter experts. And we work with, I mean, a lot of organizations like ours work with faculty, but the faculty increasingly saying, all I want to do is give my students a great experience, because I think it's good for them both on the measurable hard skills and everything else that we're talking about. And it can be deflating. It can be, because obviously faculty are dealing with more and more year in, year out. Anastasia, how do you deal with that? Because I know it comes up all the time in
Yeah.
your work.
Oh, sure. Yeah, and you nailed it. I think, I mean, I have 4 quick things I'd recommend, but the number one is working with your faculty in your departments. One, because faculty, the reason they're faculty often is because an experiential thing that happened. You talk to any
Right.
field ecologist or biologist, it's typically something that they did in the field that made them want to pursue this path. But that's true of folks in international and in many areas. And they're the primary influencers. You know, students come to our university because our faculty are amazing and they want to spend more time with our faculty. So if our faculty tell them that this is something worth doing, or if our faculty themselves are willing to take them out into the field somewhere, that's a home run if you have that coming from faculty. And also structurally, we know higher ed's not always the most flexible. And so you have to find ways for these to work within departments, within majors, so that students don't fall behind and so that they're able to graduate, continue to progress towards their degrees. The second thing I'd say is work closely with your philanthropic departments, because
Right.
if you think these experiences are important enough to offer as cornerstones of an education, it's incumbent on you to make them as accessible as possible for everybody. And that not only means funds, but it also means a certain kind of advising. The Brahmin class was referenced several times at the top of your podcast. And we know that if our funnels, thank God, have started to get bigger in higher ed. But if we want everybody to have the same access to these experiences in university, we have to be thinking about how we're advising and supporting students in thinking about what's valuable and what these pathways offer. And the last thing I would say is work with an experienced provider if you're just getting started to offer this, because the risk management aspects are not for the faint of heart, especially if you're sending 18-year-olds into the, developing parts of the world. And it's really important to work with providers who have that in mind, who know how to get parents and students up to speed, and who also know how to create the space and to react when things don't go the way you expect. I mean, that's part of why we're sending our students, is so that they encounter the unexpected, but there needs to be a very good safety net for that.
I mean, all of the study abroad, the education abroad industry had to, in a matter of weeks, return hundreds of thousands of students when COVID hit. And so there's the mechanics, the blocking and tackling of knowing how to do that. I mean, and even just dealing with visas. Most faculty do not want to spend their time contacting the local consulate or figuring out airfare or figuring out housing or any of the safety protocols or understanding the cultural dimensions. I think one of the things that Anastasia has alluded to, which is critically important, is I think sometimes institutions don't understand that the disequilibrium that these programs may cause for students across the spectrum of identity. Whatever way students are identifying, we have to recognize that they're going to be identifying like this in an entirely different context than where they were. I was talking with a senior international officer at a community college in Texas, and we were trying to figure out a way to help her students go to Scotland. And she said, my students tell me, when I say to them, I'd like you to think about this program in Edinburgh, the student said to this SIO, I've never been to Houston. I'd like to go to Houston first because I'm worried, how do I communicate to my family, predominantly first generation, Latina students, that I'm going to be safe and I'm going to be okay around the world. They're worried about me going to the largest metropolitan area that's a couple hours away, which I haven't been to. So it's understanding that context. I think faculty want these experiences, but oftentimes and I don't know what the trends are, but I think these offices of study abroad or internship or career services are getting smaller and smaller at many institutions, not the high-flying R1s and high-brand institutions, but where most students go, they're being asked to do more with less for more students, and that's a pinch point. I would think Harvard and ASU do not fall into that category, by the way. You guys do great stuff.
Well, I mean, there is a privilege to being Harvard or being ASU. So, I mean, and so I want to, again, Anastasia, thank you for bringing up the issue of equity, broadly speaking, in this, because these things cost money. And again, Howard, you talked about first gen. So sort of recognizing that this is something that is valuable, but there is also a monetary cost that somebody has to bear. So I think, again, I don't want to go into that, but I just do appreciate your highlighting those pieces. Where I want to go is a little bit sort of, and maybe Howard, you sort of touched on that a little bit, which has to do with sort of this institutional partnerships that need to be formed, right? So it's you can't do this. ASU can't just send its students go to Scotland, right? I mean, there has to be some institutional connection with an university there. So like, for instance, we have a partnership with Dublin City University, which we have established over time, which allows for us to build on this. So I want to understand a little better how you approach this sort of institutional relationships, particularly around things like credit transfer or things that way, which mean very different things in different places. How one identifies who one can partner with, whether the values and perspectives align. These are like complicated. I mean, it's not, now we are going from individual sort of cultural frames to institutional cultural frames, which can be very different. And I'm just curious about how you sort of navigate that, or what advice do you have for people who want to get into that?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, we have a broad and lively and a robust network of partner institutions that have been built up over decades. I would say in some cases the fit isn't great, and sometimes we discontinue those relationships, largely sometimes based upon the evaluation data we collect from our students. Sometimes indicate that the academic experience students were receiving was not up to par, and so we sometimes mix and match that. So I think it's about building relationships. It's understanding the field. The field is fairly sophisticated in terms of recognizing and being able to partner with a internationally based or an institution based in country someplace else. We also heavily rely, we have what we call a school of record relationship, so that we have our relationship right now is with the University of Massachusetts and Amherst. And so through our partnership with UMass Amherst, which has a long established and robust and very thoughtfully led international education department, department's the right word, we're able to grant credit and validate through our programs or they do this with many other providers, whether someone's going to a university in Costa Rica or Valparaiso, Chile, or any number of different places, Reykjavik, Iceland, that institution is providing a valid academic experience, and those credits can transfer. One of the myths that many students think and feel, and I think it's a little bit more accentuated, our research shows a little bit more accentuated among students of color, underrepresented backgrounds, and certainly first gen, that my credits won't transfer, or I can't use Title IV aid, or I can't use Pell. These are all false. That in fact, when we look at time to graduation and graduation rates compared to most students at four-year institutions on a four-year graduation rate, it's considerably higher when they've had an international experience. And so, we try and dispel those notions both to students, but also both to institutions who might say, well, I can't send my students to this school because only, we teach stats like no one else. I mean, I don't want to be flip, but we do hear that. So I think it's through relationships. I think it's through trusted partnerships that I would advocate faculty or anyone try and do. But Anastasia's in the middle. This is what you do week in and week out.
Well, I have to say that being part of the global Jesuit network makes that a lot easier. I mean, the Jesuits started out hundreds of years ago, believing in global ed, and there's, something like 200 plus institutions that we can partner with. So I think having a network, whatever your network is helpful. I also think having something to offer. Reciprocity is a really big part of learning to engage and kind of changing those paradigms that we've been talking about. And when you have something to offer a partner, for example, it may be in our case, hosting young people for the summer for some time in Silicon Valley and some time on our campus. It may be obviously exchange. That is a wonderful way to operate. When you don't, and then when it's lopsided, you have more students that want to go to places than you can bring to your campus, then you're looking at working with providers, and it does take some financial support, but you also can expand your network in different ways, particularly on topical things that matter to your students. It might be Indigenous rights, it might be environment, it might be the kind of problems that they're tackling. So it's partnerships is a very complicated. We are starting to map our partnerships at USF right now because we have so many, and we also want to make sure to. I hate to use the word to service those partnerships, but when you're a medium-sized liberal arts university, you can't spread yourself too thin. You need to deliver on a range of things for each partner. And so that necessarily means making some decisions about who you're in long-term partnerships with, and maybe using providers to cover the other places, because you can't be all things to all people.
So again, thinking about our audience, I'm also imagining that there are people who may want to study abroad, but don't have a formal program available to them. For example, my younger daughter, we were offered her an incentive for doing well at college. We said, we'll send you to London in the summer and you can sign up for a course at the University of London and have a great experience and also get some credit that'll count. And this was completely outside of the colleges. Mm-hmm. COVID intervened, and unfortunately that didn't happen. But if a young person is watching this and saying, well, I'm going to make my own study abroad opportunity, what advice would you have for them in terms of how to get the most out of it?
Mm-hmm. I was the other day I was with a group of Champlain College students up in Burlington, Vermont, where I'm traveling, and I was amazed at how much they wanted to have an experience. These were mostly students who were doing game design, game art, cybersecurity, digital arts. How much they wanted, how much they didn't know how to do it. They really, and I think it's revenge. I don't know if revenge travel is a thing or revenge education abroad is a thing, but they really wanted to be someplace else, and they were overwhelmed by the choices. And these are students within a academic program. And my response would be to any student who's thinking along these lines, or those students, is think deeply about what you want to do. What are you looking for? What experience? Push yourself a little bit. I mean, one of the things that we measure in our work is demand, and Anastasia and I have talked about this a lot, and we think institutions don't just need to meet the demand where students are, but to actually nudge them towards a more nuanced demand, do nuanced experiences that might solve some of the grand challenges that we're all facing. So I think it's a student to reflect on what do you really want to do? Do you want to just have the binge drinking experience in Seville for 2 weeks? Because I don't think that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about, how do you think both long term and both short term? Do you want to go hike in Iceland and experience the Northern Lights? Well, okay, why? What is that about? I think talking to a student who's trying to do this on their own, talk to your advisors, talk to your friends, talk to people in your community, certainly talk to your institution. We get inquiries all the time from students and their parents saying, we're thinking about Seoul, Korea in the spring of 2024. What can we do? And we rather than say, oh, you can have that program or this program at that cost or this cost, our approach is say, what are you thinking about? What do you want? What are your big questions? Which I think is often a question that students and their families don't get asked. It's usually just transactional. And we think that there's lots of people who do this really well to say let's slow down this a little bit because we understand the impetus to go. We think that process will yield a better experience. It gets a student to think through, what do I really want to do? And maybe I want to go, and maybe there's a cadence where I want to have an experience in London, come back to my home institution for a semester or two, and then have another experience in Dublin or in Londonderry, come back. I mean, there's, seems like US institutions are very much like binary, like, okay, you can go to this now, and you come back and we'll graduate you. And we think that's frankly silly because of how global the world is. And other countries who send students, quote unquote, education abroad have a much more fluid way in which to do this. The United States, I think, our education system is pretty calcified and rigid in how it thinks about this. So I would think getting a student to reflect with someone else, what are you trying to do? Something academic, something personal, is a good place to start.
I mean, I would just quickly add, pack light. I think the more empty your suitcase is, and I mean this metaphorically,
Right.
of expectations of what you want out of it, the more you'll be able to fill it with insights. And that starts with the expectation of your journey to getting to do this. Expect those barriers, particularly if you're at a school that doesn't have pathways. Most schools do have a way to petition for credit. It can be tortuous, it can be a lot of work, but most schools will allow you to do that. And know that experience of getting to do the study abroad is a great petri dish. It's a great sort of simulation of what will be happening to you in the year ahead if you succeed.
I think one area we haven't touched upon, and probably it's just because we've got deep into this question, is the non-academic work-based internship, which, there's lots of studies and lots of organizations looking at whether apprenticeships or internships for students, domestic. We and many other providers will place and locate and build a relationship with a organization, nonprofit, NGO, for-profit, or whatever. That's also another avenue for students. It's a very different experience, a very different set of outcomes, a very different set of inputs. And it requires sometimes more forethought on a student and their family's part to understand where they're going to be. But it can also be very, very, the right setting can be very impactful.
So I was smiling when he said pack light, because I have a couple of this is like random story. So when my son he went to University of Michigan and he went in undeclared major and then decided to go to the business school at the end of his first year. He got in and I told him, now that you have gotten admission into the college you want, take a year off. I will pay for your flight ticket from here, from Michigan to wherever in the world you want to go, and the flight back.
Right.
After that, you're on your own. You figure out,
Love it.
work, do something. He never took me up on it. And what I told him was, when you come back, you will be a different person, and you will bring a perspective to the coursework that none of your cohort members will have.
That's right. right.
He never took me up on it, but he did do a study abroad. There's university, and I think in Amsterdam or in the Netherlands, where U of M
Yes.
has a partnership with. So he went there and did a semester. And talking about packing light, I had to pay extra for his baggage because he packed everything that he thought he needed. He was so anxious,
Right.
to the point where towards the end he went for a skiing trip somewhere, broke his finger, bought a ticket on a Chinese airline whose website vanished between the time he bought the ticket and he could catch the flight. He calls me up and he says, I think I've broken my finger. I have to get back to Amsterdam to catch my flight back, and I have no idea how to get back. And I was
Right.
like, you've got to figure it out. Well, guess what? He found a train, ended up in Geneva, didn't have a place to live, so just walked around the lake, watched the sunset come up, sat in a coffee shop, and he still talks about it as being one of the most beautiful days of his life, all alone with a broken finger, right?
Right.
And here is the best part. Because of that, he is now our family's trip planner. He has become so organized about stuff. He backpacked across Southeast Asia with a few of his friends just with one backpack. Now he does not pay extra for baggage fees. So there is a before and after with this one kid that I just wanted to share with you.
Well, it's a great metaphor in some ways. I mean, I think maybe, having people think about packing emotionally,
No,
psychically light.
yeah, no, but you said it metaphorically. I'm saying it was literal in our lives.
Yes,
That's
right.
why
Sure.
I mean, I just want to, like, from my comments, close with the notion that, we do have to think about it. It sounds like your son, and I know I grew up, with parents who supported these things, but thinking about different avenues. This is why I think what Howard said about work kind of placements and beyond, thinking about experiential learning beyond just the traditional transfer of credit study abroad is really important in terms of giving everyone access to that experience you talked about around the lake that then makes them their family's trip planner. And it's at USF, we actually wrote a grant so that our Pell eligible students can get their passport costs covered, because sometimes just the issuance of a passport can be a hurdle. So thinking about how to knock down these hurdles, one of the solutions is to broaden the kind of experiences we're offering. And I really appreciate that Howard brought that up, and that API is doing that.
Yes, absolutely.
And I just want to say that every year the curriculum gets more crowded and the high stakes tests get longer. And we put up all these barriers to this kind of learning. One of the ideas I came across in doing co-editing a book on lifelong learning was the idea that students should declare a passion rather than declaring a major. So my younger daughter had to declare a major, and she majored in mechanical engineering. And of course, all the engineering faculty wanted to make sure that whatever subspecialty they had, she knew a lot about. But her passion really is making a difference for marginalized groups in developing countries. And if it's phrased that way, then what students and the institution understand is needed before they graduate becomes really different and much more welcoming, I think, of something like study abroad. So hopefully higher education will find ways of evolving that get us past these, kind of major centered, assessment centered.
I would double down on that, Chris, and say it has to. I mean, I think that's the imperative. I mean, one of the ironic things that we've seen in our work is the institutional disincentives for the kind of thinking you're talking about, and for students to have these experiences is pretty staggering. And that's another podcast we can do. But 3% of the students who actually want these experiences get to do them. It's tragically too low.
Well, I want to thank Anastasia and Howard, both of you. This has been terrific. As usual, we're out of time, but I hope that people will reach out to you. I wish I were younger. I'm getting excited about study abroad. maybe it's not too late for me. We'll see, but it is exciting.
You are espousing the cause of lifelong learning, Chris, so it is not too late.
Right. Anyway, thank you for coming and listening to this, and take care, everyone.